Good morning. I'm here with Ben Hayes right now. Super exciting for our first class in parenting with the experts. Over this whole series, we have the blessing of a bunch of different interviews, each of which will be about 15 to 20 minutes long, with people that we're calling the experts. I don't know how you feel about being given that title, but going through a bunch of different facets of what it means to raise your children in the church. And I'm really excited, not just about Ben Hayes, who will tell you a bit about himself in just a moment, but really excited about the topic that we're beginning with, because we tend to get pretty specific about whatever is trending these days, whatever is particularly concerning to you as a parent or maybe to your children, and really focus on specific issues. And we'll get into specific issues as this series goes on, but today we're starting with red flags just in general with your children. And we'll get into some of the specifics of what those might look like, especially in this day and age, but really just in a general sense of how we parent through these red flags, how we can see them and what we do in response to them. But Ben, I'd like for you to introduce yourself just a little bit. Your name might be a little bit familiar to hopefully a lot of people listening to this, but who are you and how might we know you?
So I am the pulpit minister at the Highland Park Church of Christ in Mussel Shoals, Alabama. I have actually preached there at Fishing and Kenny a couple of years ago. I was able to be there, and so I also have a degree, a couple of degrees in counseling, and I have a private practice in counseling. I see kids, I see young adults, I see adults, couples, just kind of general practice counseling. I also work a little bit with the school, the private school that's in our area, Marshall Bible School, and do some character ed stuff with the kids there. So I guess my only, I mean, other than the counseling part, the preaching part, I might say that I'm an expert. I don't know that I feel like an expert sometimes, but I probably have more expertise because I have 5 kids of my own. So sometimes that the experience is worth a whole lot more than the degrees are. So currently, at the moment that we're recording, I have a senior in high school and I have a kindergartner, and I have 3 in between. So
Man,
my year right now is pretty hectic. So,
I bet.
but
Oh,
so that's
sounds
a little bit.
busy.
Might know me from CYC, benandtravis.com. We do a lot of stuff, a podcast, the Helping Healing Humor podcast, and a couple others that try to help parents and young people and everybody else just deal with the struggles that they come across in life. And so we try to just offer some resources there too.
Mm, That's awesome. So Ben is definitely a huge worker in the kingdom. I knew you through your involvement with CYC. Also know Ben through his involvement with the Ministering to Youth conference, a professional development conference for youth ministers, teaching people how to minister to young people more effectively. And so a lot of people look to Ben as a leader in this area, in this field, and whether it's through the trial and error personally, or through your professional skills. I'm really excited to start to get into this topic is red flags in your children, and specifically when to step in as a parent is going to be a recurring question that we have. But before we get into that, let me ask just foundationally, what do you think are some of the most common issues facing our children today as parents and as Christians?
I think the most common thing I see, and I'll just speak from my area and where I'm at, and I think generally what I'm hearing that's the case everywhere is one of the biggest issues right now is anxiety or anxiety related things. I think that was already sort of a trend, it seemed like before COVID. I think COVID has upped the game a little bit more since then because of just all the negativity, all the negative news. It wasn't just COVID that was negative, but a lot of other things in those couple of years that we were dealing with it. We had to face a lot of political negativity, social negativity, and I just think that had an impact. The anytime that we withdraw by ourselves with our own thoughts, there's times that that's difficult. So, having kids at home all day without the social interaction for a little while, I think that had an impact. So, the anxiety, the related things to that, whether that's obsessive compulsive disorder, things like that, that's I've kind of seen an uptick in some of those things. I think also with our teenagers, of course, maybe always, maybe since the beginning of time, there seems to have been issues at that time in their life with self-worth, just with the way they see themselves. Your body's changing, your body, and especially today, there's a lot of comparing yourself to other people. It's easy to look on Facebook and compare what you have, what you look like, what your talents are with the people that you see online. And it's a really unfair comparison because you're comparing what people are allowing you to see of them to what you know about you. And those two things, aren't very fair comparison because, you can't see what's on their inside. You can't see what they're dealing with. But you're seeing all the good that they want to put out there about themselves, and then comparing that to the negative parts you see about yourself.
Yeah. And so a few of the things that you touched on are areas that we're going to dive into throughout this quarter pretty thoroughly, social media being one, and depression and anxiety being another one. I agree that those seem to be so prevalent, and especially as they go hand in hand with one another. But it's interesting, your note about quarantine really affecting that. I think everybody felt affected by it. And the conversation that I heard was really focused around younger children and what their development might have been through quarantine and how it might have been negatively affected. But it sounds like I'm hearing you say that some of the older teens at the time too would be maybe not as much in their development, but would have a very negative effect, possibly through the self-worth, the social media, and the anxiety that you can get from that type of isolation at an age where you want to be so social.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny, I mean, kind of funny about that time period was I had a couple of my older kids that had always begged, like, can you let us be homeschooled? We want to stay at home. We want to, that sort of thing. And then after we were at home for 6 months, they're like, yeah, we don't ever want to do that again. So, even in their minds, what they thought it would be was not exactly what it was. And so,
Mm.
that was just something that I think they recognized that was just hard on them. So,
Yeah. Well, then before we get too specific with some of these, I just want to ask as a very general rule of thumb, how do you balance the point of our conversation today is letting your child figure things out, understanding that kids go through hard times and that sometimes it's okay that they've had a bad day. How do you balance letting them figure things out versus stepping in to help, just in a very general sense?
there's a really good book I'll recommend as kind of a visual aid. It's called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk.
Hmm.
Pretty transformative in the way that I've um, thought about some things. It's not that I didn't know some of the things, but it did a good job of explaining it. It also has like cartoon pictures in it, so that helps me a lot as a as just someone who likes pictures. I actually listened to it first, so I didn't even know it had that. But there's some great stuff about just being able to help your kids talk through things. And so I guess it depends on which way you're talking about it. Is it something that they're coming to you about, or is it something that you see happening? If they're coming to you about it, one of the examples it gives in the book is just, a parent or a kid comes in and says, I'm so mad at Johnny, I want to hit him in the face, or, something extreme like that. And, normally we would go, well, you can't do that. That's wrong. You can't hit Johnny in the face. Well, when you kind of jump in like that, it shuts them down. They don't get a chance to figure out the emotions and what to do with the emotions. They're just told, you can't have that emotion, be quiet, and so kind of helping them walk through it from a stance of, I want to hit Johnny in the face. Well, that's interesting. It sounds like you're pretty upset. and then they get the chance to say, yeah, because he did this, 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 this. Wow. So you're really struggling with that. Yeah. Da, 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 da. So they're talking through it. So depending on whether you're talking about teenagers or you're talking about kids, and depending on if it's something they're coming to you about, I think as parents, we don't want our kids to struggle. We don't want our kids to hurt. We don't want our kids to worry. But at the same time, if we take all of that from them in every way and we don't allow them the process of working through it, then we've done them an injustice for the future, because one day I'm not going to be around. And one day I'm not going to be able to go, okay, let me take all those problems from you. And they need to be able to learn how to do that. So I think I've used the phrase, and it's probably, forgive me if it's insensitive in some way, but you need to give them enough leash so that you can teach them through their mistakes, but maybe not to hang themselves, in such a sense of, I don't want them to have so much leash that they get in trouble and there's no way to get it back, or they get hurt in the process. But I want to give them enough so that they can make mistakes, and I'm there close enough to help them work through those mistakes. I'm there to help them, figure out what the right answer would have been. But I see some parents that are so tight with what they allow their kids to do that when their kids do get freedom and go to college or they move away, that there's a lot of struggles because they don't know how to balance or deal with life on their own.
Yeah.
But yet you can give them way too much boundary, or no boundaries, and then you have problems with that too. So I think there's kind of a place in between where there's boundaries, but there's some wiggle room to allow them to make mistakes, but hopefully that they don't get hurt in those mistakes too badly.
Right. And I really like the distinction that you draw between, are they coming to you or are you noticing, red flags in their life? And I think I understand you're saying that if they're coming to you, that's always a time for guidance and for teaching. And not to necessarily do everything for them, but to always be involved if they're directly coming to you.
Guide them, just being a guide, like, or helping them learn to guide their emotions. There's another great book called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it is something I try to do at the school when I go, and I'm at like TK to fourth grade level, teaching these kids, but how to just manage their emotions. Because what differentiates between people who have similar IQs trying to get a CEO job or trying to get some, very good job, they go, hey, you guys have the same intelligence, but who knows how to manage problems better? Who knows how to deal with their emotions and the emotions of other people better? And that's really what, distinguishes between really good leaders and those who are, okay, but not great leaders, who can manage their emotions, the emotions of others, and know how to deal with problems. So helping them learn that is a big part.
Yeah. So that's a good segue into the next couple of questions that we have. If your child is coming to you with their issues, that guidance seems to be the goal that we're striving for. But what do you do when they don't? I know some kids are very communicative to their parents and have a very comfortable relationship. Even those children will sometimes have things that they're embarrassed about or are difficult to communicate. And then other kids, for whatever reason, are just quieter, whether it's shy or soft-spoken, or they're hitting a phase of life of insecurity. What do you do if you, well, I guess this is kind of two parts. How can you tell if you have a quiet kid that they're going through a tough time? And then what do you do about that?
It can be tough because there's a lot of changes that happen in teenage years anyway. Everybody changes. Your brain chemistry changes. Your brain grows more from or as much during the teenage years and adolescent years as it does when your kids are 2. That's the 2 times your brain grows the most or changes the most.
Mm.
So you probably will notice that there's a very similar uh, behavioral things with teenagers and 2-year-olds, except 2-year-olds don't communicate well. Teenagers do, but they don't want to. So it's, it's a little bit different. But there's a lot of things going on in the brain. So there's changes anyway. But the biggest thing I usually want to point people to is just look for changes.
Mhm.
Have they changed the amount of time they want to spend with their friends? Is there a drastic change in their behavior, a drastic change in their appetite, in their sleep patterns, which that changes some in teens years anyway, because of the melatonin in the body and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different things that change during that time anyway. But looking for significant changes, looking for not really wanting to go and do things, not eating well, not or eating too much, not sleeping well. Their hobbies, they just don't want to do it anymore. When you start seeing some big major changes, several of them even at one time, those are the times that I go, okay, I feel like something's going on here.
Yeah,
We
and
might
that goes hand in hand too with this next question, because I think there are some issues specifically with teenagers that are more normal. Shouldn't require a lot of anxiety for a parent, and if they're having a bad day or going through a mild breakup, that you might see some of those red flags that you can help with for sure and continue to provide comfort and guidance, but wouldn't necessarily be something serious. Whereas it seems like in this day and age, a lot of teens also struggle with some really serious things. And whether
yeah.
that's self-harm or a bad breakup leading to severe depression or any number of other things, how do you differentiate between some of those red flags that you were just mentioning? How can you tell if it's a normal, bad day, bad week of a teenager's life versus something more serious that you really need to get involved with soon?
That may be something that's a little bit more specific for every kid. I mean, just really watching them and knowing them. Every one of my kids have a different personality. So it would probably manifest itself a little different with each one of them. But I think again, something that I talk with clients about is when they come in with some complaint, I a lot of times ask, what's the frequency and the intensity? How often is this happening and how intense is this feeling?
Mm.
So, with a mood shifts and changes in teenagers are normal, but depending on how frequent, depending on how intense those things are, I might go, hey, I need some help with that. I also recognize that as a parent, I don't see things as well as I do in other people's kids, like with my own kids. So I think it's important sometimes, even for me, I will occasionally grab a trusted friend or a counselor at school or somebody and go, hey, can you check in on my son or check in on my daughter? Can
Mm.
you just see? Because I'm just noticing some things and it may just be nothing, but they're not talking as much or they're not doing this as much. And I'm just wondering, they don't want to be in this activity anymore. Could you talk to them and just tell me if you think that there's something that might be going on, or is it just that they've lost their interest in that particular thing? And so I think it's important as a church, even as quote unquote experts, when it's dealing with your own kid, and I've seen a lot of other counselors' kids, and I've actually counseled other counselors, and I've had, things like that where it's hard to see it in your own life. Sometimes you can see it in other people's and you can see, oh man, I see where that's going. But with your own, you get clouded in your judgment. So I think it's very appropriate for you to seek outside help. I've had a lot of parents come to me with their kids and they say, my kid won't talk to you. They don't talk to anybody. They don't want to talk to anybody. They don't want to talk to us, at least. And, after the session, they go, yeah, I want to go back because they found a place where they felt like they could open up and not be, have their parents chew them out over whatever the answer was, or that parent, because I mean, I up front say, I don't share these things unless, I've learned about child abuse or elderly abuse, or, you're a danger to yourself or to someone else. At a certain age, I've got the right to keep their stuff confidential and not share with parents. Well, the moment they know that, they can let the guard down and say whatever they need to say.
Hmm.
And so sometimes, it may just be helpful to go, hey, I feel like my kid's struggling with something, and I want them to have a safe place to talk, even if it's not me,
Hmm.
and allow them that exit strategy, I guess, to be
Oh,
able to talk about things.
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it can be tough to see how severe the problem is just by the red flags that they're showing. And so figuring out what is bothering them just seems to be the most important thing, whether that's through your communication with them as a parent or seeking some of those outside resources. But kind of pivoting for the next few questions, and then we'll wrap up here in just a couple minutes. Um, you touched on guiding being maybe the most important component of this discussion at the beginning of it. How much of these red flags and kind of danger zones of your child's upbringing, how much of that do you think is handled through guidance versus managing surroundings? Because that's one thing that I hear quite a bit. It goes into the debate of public school versus private school, controlling what media they watch and their access to technology, and sometimes even what friends they're allowed to have or not have. Where do you stand on the balance between guidance through all sorts of things versus managing the situation that they're in?
I'm probably more on the end of the spectrum of guiding your child than I am managing the surroundings. And I'm not going to say I don't manage some of the surroundings. I'm trying to remember the exact way that the statement is made, but it's preparing your child for the path rather than preparing the path for your child.
Hmm.
And the idea of, you know, there will come a time when I can't manage their surroundings, so I want them to be able to learn how to do that. There are limits of what I let my kids watch. There's certain things at certain ages I don't want them watching. But I probably let them watch more things than other people do. But they understand in our house there's certain things that aren't said, certain things that aren't done. And again, I'm going to manage that to a certain extent, but I also realize, and they tell me, my kids have told me, I hear that word at school all the time, or I hear that word around other people all the time. So it's like, and I say, I get that. I just don't want that too often in your ears. You know, there's probably some, PG-13 movies and things that we allow, but there is an understanding of what's allowed and what's not as far as our communication. And why do some people allow these things? Why do some people do these things? And we have those conversations. So we try to help guide them into, you're going to hear this. I mean, as a counselor, I hear everything under the sun, but I don't repeat those things. And I recognize that, too much can influence. And there's going to be parents that are hearing this that probably are going to, be on the other end of the spectrum for me. I'm just giving you my perspective on it.
Right.
So I think there's that. There is, I wanted to mention something, and you guys can research this on your own. There's something called ACEs. I don't know if you've heard of that, adverse childhood experiences. So it's a common thing that's being studied today, over the last several years, just about what is going on in the world. And so what it is it's basically traumatic experiences. And a lot of problems that are happening in adulthood, young adulthood, are the result, even physically, not just emotionally, but physically, cardiovascular issues, are coming because of these adverse childhood experiences. So that could be, abuse, it could be neglect, it could be household challenges like divorce or domestic violence, or substance abuse in the family, or mental health issues in the family, even down to bullying, community violence, natural disasters, war-torn areas. So with that being the case, there are some managing of the surroundings that I want to do, because I want to limit the amount of those adverse childhood experiences. In 2000, and I'm just going to read this because this was something I was looking at earlier based on the questions. 2019, there were 144,000 adults that were interviewed across 25 states. Out of those, 61% had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. There was about 16% of those adults interviewed had 4 or more of those experiences. So thinking in terms of how many people are being, affected by those things, and probably in the room right now, you could look at, the abuse and neglect and household challenges and others of your adults, and they could probably go, yeah, I had some of those experiences. Well, how did that affect you? How did that affect you emotionally? Well, I don't want to put my kids in places or allow them to go to places where there might be some of those things, where, I want to protect them within my bubble, in my house from some of those things. But I also want to think, okay, is that a safe environment for them to go to?
Right.
Could some of those things occur in those places? And so I think it's important to think about your surroundings from that extent.
Right.
But I do lean probably heavily on the guiding.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you say kind of two different variables with managing surroundings, and one being frequency, that exposure to the world and all sorts of things in it is okay, but you had mentioned that if it's so frequent that it starts to change how they think or sit in their heart, that can be a big issue. And then severity, that if there's anything that just seems so extreme or potentially unsafe, that those are areas where you would manage surroundings, and the rest of it, you really lean towards guidance. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I mean, think about ourselves. I mean, us as adults, we do the same thing,
Mhm.
right? I mean, there's a certain standard to where I go, I don't want to hear that anymore. I don't want to see that anymore. And I know what my brain, I also know that the brain of a child is a little bit more, and of a teenager is a little bit more plastic. They say, those avenues are continuing to change, and they learn things quicker than I can learn things. So I do want to protect them on a certain level, but I protect myself on a certain level on those
Right.
things. But I also know what's safe for me, and I'm not going to go certain areas and certain things and be a part of certain things because of the temptation. So I want to also sort of manage that and help my kids learn to manage that too.
Right. Well, for time's sake, I think that'll be our last question, but wanted to ask if you had any closing thoughts for us, or anything that you'd been thinking about with this conversation that was left unsaid.
I think that was about it. Those are some of the things that I see the most, and I appreciate. I mean, I think parents have a really difficult job. I always looked forward to being a parent. I still love being a parent. But I'm also recognizing, and this is no slight to you or to any other youth minister, but there was a lot of things I knew for certain as a youth minister that have changed as I've become a parent. And it's not that they were wrong necessarily, but it does make a big difference once you have kind of, and with each age group, it's changed. So
Right.
as I had a baby, I understood things a certain way. And Travis, my cousin, will often say about, some of the things he experienced some difficulty growing up. His dad was kind of distant from him, but he's since said, my dad was learning how to be a dad at the same time I was learning how to be a kid. He had never had kids. He didn't know what it was like. And so he said, I've learned to give him a little bit of grace because he was learning too.
Mhm.
And so, give yourself some grace. And maybe if the kids watch this, give your parents some grace a little bit. They're learning too. But I think the more you can communicate with your kids, with little ones, it's play that makes, is how they communicate. With teenagers, they begin to talk a little bit more, and just learning how to communicate with them, get in their world, play the stuff they play, do the stuff they do, play video games with them, play the silly games that they play. And that may open up some opportunity to see some of the things that you're looking for and talk to them about them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your thoughts. It's really good advice and wisdom, and will definitely be some food for thought and discussion. But thanks for talking with us, and we'd love to have you back sometime soon. But that'll be it for this interview, and then we'll have our discussion in just a moment.
Thanks for having me.